Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Chivalry Medieval Warfare's DLC called Chivalry Deadliest Warrior. This was released in November of 2013, and it's kind of interesting because it's a crossover with the Spike television series Deadliest Warrior, which, if you're not familiar with that, basically took two historical warriors and pitted them against each other and was like, who would win, blah blah blah. It wasn't particularly accurate in terms of its science or anything like that, but it was just an entertaining show, and it makes total sense to do something related to a video game about it. And there was a really crappy fighting game made from it, but then there was this as well. So the question there becomes, how is this DLC? Does it add to Chivalry Medieval Warfare and make it a better game overall? How does it do justice to the idea? That sort of thing. Well, in terms of presentation, it's pretty much exactly as the base game is, the Chivalry Medieval Warfare. The difference being that Deadliest Warrior runs in 64-bit by default. You have to specifically select the 32-bit executable. But it's kind of weird in that it's really bright compared to the base game. The base game itself had a lot of brown and gray and realistic kind of stuff going on, but it still had a fair amount of color in there as well. This one goes a lot more in the color direction and has some pretty wild environment changes from the base game. Base game is all basically medieval European kind of stuff. This one, on the other hand, has numerous environments like a sort of Greek temple-looking area that is very bright, very colorful. There's a tropical environment, and so on and so forth, for a total of 6 maps, and it all looks just as good as the base game does. In some cases slightly better, but not a huge degree of difference. And it is really nice to be able to have so much color in this thing, as opposed to mostly being brown and gray and realistic like the base game was. That said, the animations are still kinda janky in a lot of respects. They're really weird and stiff, and particularly with the reloading animations for the crossbow, for the guns that the pirates have, they just look horrible, really. They're just really clunky, really awkward. They do not look realistic in the slightest, and it just kinda is jarring compared to the relatively realistic melee animations. So there is some work they could have done there, but they just chose not to. At any rate, the graphics themselves look fine for the most part, and they're certainly nothing that's going to blow your mind, but they're serviceable enough. And despite what a lot of people seem to think, this game does run decently, at the very least. I get pretty much constant 60 FPS, though to be fair, I do have a pretty beefy rig. A lot of people complain that there are frame rate issues, but I don't experience them personally, so I can't really comment too much on that. That said, it really doesn't look very different from the base game, so if you had performance issues in the base game, you're probably going to have performance issues in Deadliest Warrior as well, so just keep that in mind. All that said, the sound design is also about as it was in the base game, with some of the stuff being straight up reused. Like, a lot of the sound effects are reused. The Agatha Knight's voice clips were reused for the Knight class in Deadliest Warrior, so you're getting a lot of bleed over from that. And the new voice clips are pretty much what you would expect. They're corny, they're ridiculous, and they work pretty well for the most part. It's just kind of over the top, and it rolls with it. So they still have that sort of thing in the sound design. And that goes for the music as well. It's pretty much exactly as it was in base Chivalry, just with some slight tweaks here and there. And then it comes to what really matters here, which is the gameplay. There's not any story to this thing. It's just basically free-for-all and multi-team and things like that. So you have very similar gameplay to the base game. You have your basic melee system of being able to thrust, to do a horizontal slash or a vertical slash, each with different buttons. And you have a timing-based parry system like you did in the base game as well. And of course, there is a variety of classes to choose from that will give you different weapons, different abilities, that sort of thing. The difference with the base game is that they kind of went all out on the classes this time around. This time, every class definitely feels different, except for the knight and the samurai. They have very, very similar play styles, except that the knight is just heavier and slower, and has very familiar weapons to if you've played the base game. But the samurai has the additional ability of when they draw their katana, they actually immediately slash with it. So if you can manage to make that connect, like I did in my How to Fail video on this, then that will actually do a fair amount of damage. It's basically the equivalent of doing a vertical slash, only you're doing it on the draw instead of just having to pull the sword out and then swing. So that's pretty nice. But that's really the only major thing that differentiates the samurai from the knight. They're both fairly slow. They're both using fairly similar weapons. The knight gets shields and they get a crossbow, whereas the samurai gets the yumi, which is their Japanese longbow, and they get a variety of two-handed weapons as opposed to the sword and shield kind of thing that the knight can do. But they're pretty similar play styles. Where things really start to branch off is in the Spartan, where they can actually get spears that they can throw, and they get a shield that they can do a bash with that's actually kind of overpowered, honestly. It does a ridiculous amount of damage, and it's pretty hard to avoid. So that's kind of irritating if you're on the receiving end of someone who's spamming the shield bash, and I've been guilty of that myself. The Viking can actually dual-wield weapons for additional damage, or they can start throwing their weapons at things, and that includes both swords, axes, shields even, and when a Viking throws their shield at you, that's just incredibly amusing. But other than that, they're pretty straightforward melee fighters. And then there's, of course, the ninja and the pirate. The pirate being the only class in the entire game that gets guns, which are ridiculously powerful but very slow to load, and they're actually kind of hard to hit with. And they only get some light one-handed weapons to have as their sort of backup, but they are pretty light and maneuverable. And then there's the ninja, which can throw shuriken, but they also get a variety of weapons, and they also have the ability to dodge and roll to the sides and such like that. So that makes them a pretty unique play style compared to pretty much everybody else, but they're also basically the squishiest character class in the entire game. So that's what they really did to differentiate this from the main game, where you only had 4 classes, and a lot of the weapons actually bled over between the various classes. In Chivalry Deadliest Warrior, every single class has its own set of weapons that you can unlock as you go through the game. And as you rank up, you will unlock new weapons, and eventually you will be able to unlock a different hat or helmet for the various classes. So that's kind of nice, I guess, but other than that, it's pretty much the same kind of stuff you saw in base Chivalry. They also changed things up with the game modes. They include multi-team deathmatch, where each class basically has its own team, or you can have different teams based on color, and just have a variety of classes within that particular team. And you're working against the other teams to, of course, get the highest score. So that definitely shakes things up from the standard one team versus one team dynamic, and you have a large variety of teams. The problem comes in when people start really playing it like base Chivalry, in that a lot of people will just jump over to one team or another, and so you'll basically have 2 teams and then maybe one fringe team where they have a way lower number of players than the other teams do, and they just get lost in the fold. And without any real auto-balancing kind of stuff in this game, that can become pretty problematic. And it also doesn't help that the classes themselves are not particularly well balanced. Namely, the Spartan is kind of overpowered, and you'll see a lot of people playing pirates and ninjas as well. Most of the ninjas because they can dodge incredibly quickly, and they get a staff that is actually pretty ridiculously powerful. You don't see a lot of people playing samurai, usually, and you get a fair number of people playing knights and Vikings, but the game really is dominated by Spartans, ninja, and pirates, because they're basically the most powerful classes in the game. And so you'll see a lot of those running around, and then you won't see as many of the other classes. Even though, as you'll be able to see in this video, I do pretty well as a knight, in fact. And partly because I'm very familiar with that playstyle, having played base Chivalry. But even then, it's just kind of a mess. When you get into the game, it has its moments. You have those moments of just pure awesome, where in, for example, my How to Fail video, the guy is charging you and he's screaming, and then you just whip out your katana and instantly slice his head off. That kind of thing is friggin' awesome. You feel fantastic. And then you get blindsided by about 3 or 4 different dudes who all just attack you at once, and you just go down incredibly quickly. And that happens more often than not, really. It's just kind of a mess when you're playing this thing. There's just these huge melees where you're not really sure what's going on. Team damage is a thing, so more often than not you'll get caught in a melee and accidentally hit your teammate, and you'll just be like, well, crap, because now I got a extra few seconds on my respawn timer and things like that. And it ultimately just doesn't really do all that much to differentiate itself from base Chivalry. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes the DLC just feel tacked on. And while I did manage to have some fun with it on occasion, more often than not, it just pissed me off. Because I would get in a melee, and then there would come some Spartan in there and just start shield bashing, or stabbing with a spear, or a ninja would roll around and be basically impossible for me to hit, and then just smack me upside the head with their quarterstaff a few times. I would get swarmed by any number of the different classes and just mowed down incredibly quickly because my team was off doing something stupid, or it was a free-for-all. And I mean, free-for-all is basically the dominant mode here, that and multi-team deathmatch, because, let's face it, apparently people really like their clusterfucks. So that's what the game really devolves into in Chivalry Deadliest Warrior. It ultimately devolves into a clusterfuck whenever you get into a melee, which is not really where the game shines. Now, it's one thing if you're playing Chivalry and Medieval Warfare and you have all these objectives you can complete, or you're trying to do more one-on-one or even just two-on-one battles. But Deadliest Warrior really likes the just big jumble for some reason. And whether that's just the way the classes play out, or whether it's just the way the players are, I'm not entirely sure, honestly. It just seems like there's way more of just this complete mess of 7 different dudes all fighting in the same area all at once and not being able to really do much of anything because you're getting hit from this side and that side and the other side and everything. And that's to say nothing of when a pirate gets a lucky shot in and just insta-gibs you from basically across the map, because they can do that with their guns. Because at least if you're using bows or crossbows, you have to compensate for the projectile drop and everything, and it really requires a headshot to instantly kill. The guns in Chivalry don't really require that unless you're going up against knights, basically. So most classes, it's basically one shot and they're dead. And so the guns just feel cheap, even though they do have some pretty hefty drawbacks, and you do have to learn how to actually hit things with them. But even then, the DLC just ends up being not all that fun most of the time. It just ends up pissing me off most of the time. Now, admittedly, that's my thoughts. There are plenty of people who love this DLC, but I find that the base game just has a better flow to it. It has a better game dynamic, partly because it's so much more centered around objective play as opposed to being basically a pure deathmatch game, which is basically what Chivalry Deadliest Warrior is. Even though there actually are objective modes available in Deadliest Warrior, I have never actually been able to play one because all people choose when it comes to vote for a map is deathmatch. Team deathmatch, multi-team deathmatch, free-for-all, those 3 things. That's basically all people choose, and it just kind of gets tiring after a while. Which is weird, because Chivalry Medieval Warfare doesn't really get tiring. It just gets better and better the more you play it, really. I mean, you kind of hit a ceiling with it eventually, but still, that's with any multiplayer game, and Deadliest Warrior just doesn't really do all that much to ingratiate you right from the start. It's basically an unbalanced, abandoned mess. I mean, the developers have basically abandoned this DLC at this point. And the lack of content for it really shows when you're actually going into this thing versus the base game. Because the base game has had content updates fairly regularly since its release, and those have really fleshed the game out quite a lot. Whereas with Deadliest Warrior, they basically dropped the DLC and said, okay, we're done. And it may have gotten a patch or two, but it didn't really get any new stuff, per se. So it feels neglected. It is unbalanced. It's not horrendously unbalanced to the point where it's unplayable or anything, but it's unbalanced. There's definitely a clear bias toward one of the two of the classes, and you see that just from how people end up playing it. But ultimately, it's just that lack of real gameplay flow that really just ruins Deadliest Warrior. It's not a bad DLC per se, but I really can't recommend getting it at full price, that's for sure. Unless, of course, completely chaotic melee is really your thing, in which case, I guess, go for it. But I just can't recommend Deadliest Warrior. I really don't have much fun with it, and that's really sad, because the concept itself is really cool. And it's got that Chivalry medieval warfare gameplay, but ported over to this idea and done in a more deathmatch sense. So I guess if you like the deathmatch side of medieval warfare, which honestly is really the weakest part of the game, then this is the DLC for you, because it's basically pure deathmatch and not much else. But if you're like me and you much prefer the objective style that medieval warfare has, you probably won't get very much out of Deadliest Warrior. Thanks for watching.